The silver medical alert bracelet hit the polished mahogany desk with a heavy, hollow clink. The air conditioning hummed a low, freezing note against the back of my neck. The sharp, chemical scent of lemon furniture polish suddenly made my stomach turn over. I reached out. The metal felt like ice under my fingertips. My thumb traced a deep, half-moon scratch near the safety clasp. I knew that scratch. I made it myself with a tiny screwdriver when the latch got stuck. It belonged on the wrist of my mother-in-law. Beatrice Pike was supposed to be lost in the fog of severe dementia, locked away in a memory care facility for the last 3 years. I turned the cold metal over. A unique serial number was engraved into the back plate. Attorney Naomi Brooks watched my hand tremble. She folded her fingers over the thick stack of legal documents. "Meredith," she said, her voice dropping into that careful tone people reserve for the bereaved. "The serial number matches the protective custody inventory. Did you hear what I just read? I was 39 years old. I worked nights as a physical therapist, lifting elderly patients twice my weight and teaching stroke victims how to find their balance again. I was entirely used to keeping my feet planted on solid ground. But sitting in that leather chair, the floor felt entirely absent. You said $85 million, I managed to whisper, my voice cracking on the numbers. And a house. Total asset value, yes, Naomi corrected gently. Your late Uncle Gideon left his entire estate to you. That includes a $10 million property, liquid cash, dividend-paying stocks, and several commercial real estate holdings. You are a very wealthy woman. I looked down at my lap. My work shoes had a patch of industrial glue holding the left sole together. My knuckles were white from gripping a reusable plastic bag that contained half a turkey sandwich. None of this made any sense. When my life fell apart, Gideon had gone silent. I simply assumed he took my former husband's side. My gaze drifted back to the scratched silver bracelet. "Why is her bracelet here?" I asked, pointing a shaking finger at the metal. "Harrison told everyone his mother did not know her own name anymore." Naomi leaned forward. "Beatrice Pike is alive. She is legally competent, and she is waiting for you in the east wing of your new mansion." The sound of Naomi closing the thick estate folder snapped loudly in the quiet room. It sounded exactly like a deadbolt sliding into place. 5 years vanished in a single heartbeat. I was back on the wet concrete of my old life. It was raining that night. Harrison stood in the doorway of the home we had shared for 14 years, holding my worn navy blue suitcase by the handle. He wore his tailored charcoal suit, looking completely calm. Just behind his shoulder stood Celeste. She was 20 years old, freshly hired at his company, and she was wearing my silk bathrobe. "You are making a scene, Meredith," Harrison had said. He used that practiced, gentle disappointment he reserved for difficult clients. "This is my home," I sobbed, reaching for the doorframe. Harrison blocked my hand with his arm. "We both know that is not true. You are too old to start over, but you are far too old for me to keep pretending this marriage works." He handed me the suitcase. It felt incredibly light. He had only packed a few sweaters and a pair of jeans. I should have fought him, but the trap had been set over a decade earlier. Before our wedding, Harrison required me to sign a one-sided prenuptial agreement. The document treated our home and his controlling interests in Silverhaven Senior Living as separate premarital trust assets. When he locked me out that night, he also froze our joint checking accounts. During the divorce proceedings, he threatened to keep the business valuation litigation going until I drowned in legal debt. Terrified and exhausted, I accepted a modest settlement. That money vanished within 3 months, completely consumed by my own attorney fees, the massive credit card debt he quietly left in my name, and the exorbitant costs required to renew my physical therapy license in a new county. I survived, but I survived on absolute scraps. Driving away from the law office now, my hands gripped the steering wheel of my rusted sedan. I took the scenic route past the rehabilitation center where I worked the night shift. I looked at the loading dock behind the cafeteria. For my first year alone, I used to wait by those back doors. I ate the untouched portions of baked chicken and dry rice that the kitchen staff planned to throw away at the end of the day. I wrapped the food in paper napkins and ate in my car, praying no one I knew would walk by. For 3 weeks between apartments, I actually slept in the back seat of this very car. I never called Gideon. I was too ashamed of my poverty. Yet Gideon had left me everything. And somehow, he had taken Beatrice with him. The navigation system directed me out of the city limits, winding up a steep, forested hill toward a private residential community. I pulled up to a set of towering wrought iron gates. I rolled down my window to press the intercom button, but the gates simply glided open in absolute silence. The mansion sat at the end of a sweeping circular driveway. Built of pale stone, it featured tall windows that reflected the afternoon sun. It was imposing, but it did not feel gaudy. It felt like a fortress. I parked my battered car next to a pristine stone fountain. Before I could reach the heavy wooden front door, it swung open. An older woman with kind eyes and a crisp gray cardigan stood in the entryway. "You must be Meredith," the woman said, offering a warm smile. "I am June. Mr. Lane hired me to keep the house running. We have been expecting you." "Thank you," I replied, stepping into the massive foyer. The polished marble floors gleamed, and the air smelled faintly of fresh lilies. "Naomi Brooks said my mother-in-law is here." June nodded, her expression softening. "She is in the East Wing. Mr. Lane had it specially renovated for her." I followed the housekeeper down a long, sunlit corridor. The architecture began to subtly shift. The decorative rugs gave way to smooth, non-slip hardwood flooring. The doorways were distinctly wider. I noticed a discreet metal ramp placed over a small step, and small silver emergency call buttons installed near the baseboards. My clinical training recognized the modifications instantly. This space was built to keep an elderly resident perfectly safe while preserving their dignity. We stopped outside a set of double oak doors. Faint music drifted through the wood. It was a radio broadcast, a deep voice discussing European history. "She usually listens to her programs around this time," June murmured. She knocked lightly twice, then opened the door and stepped back to let me enter alone. The room was vast and flooded with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick historical biographies. Sitting in a high-backed velvet armchair by the window was Beatrice Pike. My breath caught in my throat. I braced myself for the hollow, vacant stare of severe cognitive decline. I expected a heavily sedated woman lost in the fog of her own failing mind. That was the story Harrison had sold to his siblings and to the world. But Beatrice sat perfectly straight. Her silver hair was elegantly pinned back, and she wore a soft lavender blouse tucked into tailored trousers. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling slightly, but her chin was lifted with undeniable pride. She reached out, her fingers finding the radio dial with practiced ease, and turned the volume down to a low hum. She turned her head and looked directly into my eyes. There was no fog. There was only a sharp, painful clarity. "You cut your hair," Beatrice said. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, raspy from age, but the cadence belonged to the former history teacher I had known for a decade. I took a hesitant step forward, my old shoes squeaking against the polished floor. "Beatrice," I whispered. "You know who I am." "Of course I know who you are, Meredith," the older woman replied, offering a sad, fragile smile. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit down. You look like you might faint." I practically collapsed into the velvet cushions. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the brilliant woman sitting in front of me with the tragedy Harrison had paraded around town. "He said you were gone," I told her. "He told everyone the disease took your mind. He said you were violent, that you forgot his name, that you needed locked doors for your own safety." Beatrice looked down at her hands. She rubbed her left wrist, right where the silver medical bracelet used to sit. "My son is a very convincing man. He builds comfortable cages, and he paints them to look like care." "I do not understand," I said, shaking my head. "How did you get here? Why did you not tell anyone you were okay?" "Because for a very long time I was not okay," she answered honestly. A shadow crossed her face, a flicker of genuine trauma that made my chest ache. When they give you enough pills, you begin to believe the lies they tell you about yourself. But we have time for that story later. Right now, there is something I need to tell you. She leaned forward, and her pale blue eyes locked onto mine. "The night Harrison threw you out into the rain," Beatrice said softly, "you were wearing your slippers. But before you walked down the driveway, you stopped. You took my green gardening shoes, The heavy ones, and you tucked them under the porch stairs so I would not trip over them in the morning. Tears burned the backs of my eyes. I had completely forgotten doing that. It was an instinct, a final act of care in a house that was violently rejecting me. Nobody else saw you do that, Beatrice continued, her voice thick with emotion. Celeste was upstairs. Harrison was turning off the porch light. But I was looking through the kitchen blinds. I saw you. She reached out, her trembling hand resting on top of mine. Her skin felt warm and papery thin. I am so sorry I did not open the door, Meredith. I was a coward. I looked at the woman who had been my only family for 14 years. The anger I had carried for 5 years wavered, replaced by a deep, terrifying confusion. If she was this lucid, if she remembered exactly what happened, then her disappearance into the memory care facility was not a medical tragedy. It was a calculated removal. You do not have to apologize, I told her, my voice tightening. Harrison controlled everything. Beatrice squeezed my hand, then slowly pulled hers back. She glanced at the antique grandfather clock ticking in the corner of the room. The warmth in her eyes faded, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. Gideon passed away 3 weeks ago, Beatrice stated, smoothing the fabric of her trousers. Naomi filed the necessary probate documents this morning, which means the public record has been updated. Okay, I said slowly, not following her logic. Harrison employs a team of lawyers to monitor real estate and estate filings in this county, the older woman explained, her tone flattening out into pure facts. He knows Gideon is dead. He knows the trust has transferred. And by tonight, he will figure out that the east wing of this estate is occupied. A chill ran down my spine. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. He will come here, Beatrice warned, gripping the armrests of her chair. Her knuckles turned white. And Meredith, you must listen to me carefully. When my son arrives at those gates, he will not come for the $85 million first. She looked toward the window, out at the long driveway. He will come for me. Before I could ask what she meant, my cell phone buzzed in my pocket. Naomi had sent me a text message containing a secure link to the estate security system. I opened the link, and a live black and white video feed filled my screen. The camera pointed at the heavy iron gates I had just driven through. Rain was beginning to fall, slicking the asphalt. A sleek, black luxury vehicle rolled slowly past the wrought iron barrier. It did not stop. It simply crept along the perimeter, the tinted windows facing the estate, before turning around at the end of the road to make a second pass. I did not need to see the license plate to know who was driving. The morning sun cut harsh angles across the marble kitchen island. I sat across from my former mother-in-law, watching her carefully butter a piece of toast. Beatrice moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, but her hands trembled just enough to make the silver knife rattle against the porcelain plate. The house looks exactly the way Gideon described it to me, Beatrice said. She took a small bite of the bread. He told me he wanted the east wing to face the morning sun. He said it back in late November, right after I moved into the facility. She stopped chewing. A deep frown settled over her features. No, she murmured, her voice dropping. That is not right. It was raining heavily when I arrived. It must have been January. My clinical training flared to life instantly. Working the night shift at the rehabilitation center meant I spent hours charting cognitive decline. I watched her pupils, checking for dilation, and noted the sudden, terrifying blankness in her pale blue eyes. For 3 agonizing seconds, a cold knot of genuine fear formed in my stomach. What if Harrison had told a partial truth? What if the dementia was real, and Gideon had simply removed a deeply sick woman from professional care to spite his enemy? Beatrice looked up from her plate, catching my panicked expression. She did not get angry, and she did not become defensive. She simply set the knife down and straightened her spine. When a facility physician triples your sedative dosage because the administrator demands it, you lose your grasp on the calendar, she explained, her tone entirely rational. You forget whether it is Tuesday or Thursday. You forget the exact month you walked through the locked doors. But losing a date on a calendar does not mean I surrendered my fundamental understanding of who I am. My memory is bruised from the medication, Meredith. It is not broken. Do not look at me the way he did. Shame flooded my chest, hot and uncomfortable. I looked down at my coffee mug. I am sorry, I told her quietly. I spent 14 years doubting my own sanity because of him. I should know better. The heavy oak doors to the kitchen swung open before Beatrice could reply. Naomi Brooks walked in carrying a sleek leather briefcase, looking perfectly rested in a sharp navy suit. The estate attorney set her bag on the counter and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. We need to review the legal framework before Harrison makes his next move, Naomi announced, taking the stool next to me. Did Uncle Gideon have legal authority to take her out of Silver Haven? I asked, still worried about the police arriving and accusing us of medical abduction. Gideon did not abduct anyone, the lawyer replied, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. 2 years ago, your uncle began working with a statewide elder rights advocacy organization. Through their routine facility reviews, he discovered Beatrice. Gideon immediately hired 2 independent, board-certified neurologists. They visited the care center, conducted exhaustive cognitive evaluations, and concluded Beatrice possessed full legal capacity. Naomi tapped a document bearing a red seal. Here is the crucial fact, Meredith. Harrison never possessed a court-appointed guardianship. I stared at the attorney, completely stunned. But he told his brother and sister he had total legal control. He told everyone. He lied, Beatrice said flatly. He relied on a disputed financial power of attorney and his professional reputation as the chief executive of the company, Naomi clarified. Because Beatrice was housed in his facility, and because he controlled the visitor logs, no one ever challenged his authority. Once the independent doctors cleared her, Beatrice signed her own voluntary discharge paperwork and walked out the front doors. It was completely lawful. The lawyer slid an architectural blueprint across the marble. You inherited the estate, Naomi continued, looking directly at me. You own the walls, the land, and the assets. But Beatrice holds a protected lifetime residency clause for the East Wing. You cannot legally evict her, and Harrison cannot legally remove her without petitioning a superior court judge. Gideon designed this arrangement so neither of you would hold absolute power over the other. I looked at the blueprints, and an immense wave of relief washed over me. Gideon had not just given me money, he had given me a boundary. Beatrice reached across the table and touched the edge of the paper. Is the little grocery store on 5th Street still open? She asked unexpectedly. The one with the green awning? The question caught me completely off guard. It closed 2 years ago, I answered. Why? I used to send the postal worker there to buy stamps, Beatrice murmured, her gaze drifting toward the window. And money orders. My breath caught in my throat. I reached into my worn leather purse and pulled out my wallet. From behind my driver license, I extracted a faded, expired grocery voucher. The thermal paper was worn thin at the creases, but I had kept it for 5 years as a reminder of the days I almost gave up. I set the fragile paper on the marble counter. Was this you? Beatrice looked at the purple ink stamped across the top. Her chin quivered, just once, before she forced her expression to smooth out. I sent 18 of those vouchers. A sympathetic nurse helped me mail them before Harrison moved her to another floor. I only received 11, I whispered. Those 11 envelopes had literally kept me alive when I was sleeping in my car. I had always assumed Gideon sent them out of quiet guilt. While I was eating leftover cafeteria food, the woman the world declared insane had been fighting through the fog of heavy sedatives to buy me groceries. Harrison took control of my personal checking account during the 12th week, Beatrice explained, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He noticed $40 missing here and $50 missing there. He told me I was becoming financially irresponsible. Then he took my checkbook for my own protection. That is when the isolation truly began. The coffee maker on the counter hissed, spitting hot steam into a glass carafe. It did not happen overnight, the older woman continued, tracing the rim of her teacup. My son started with incredibly small things. He would move my reading glasses from the nightstand to the kitchen counter, and then he would sigh and tell me I had forgotten where I left them. He started hiding my spare house keys. He canceled my weekly physical therapy appointments without telling me, and when I missed them, he would look at me with such overwhelming pity. She took a small sip of her tea. When he brought that 20-year-old girl into your house, I yelled at him, Beatrice said. I told him he was destroying his family. Harrison looked at me like I was a hysterical toddler. He told Celeste I was just confused and highly emotional. A week later, He convinced me to stay at Silver Haven for a 2-week evaluation. Just to adjust my blood pressure medication, he promised. Her hands tightened around the porcelain cup. Those 2 weeks became 3.5 years. The cold stone of anger settled permanently into my chest. I looked at the brave woman sitting across from me. "I will help you," I told her, keeping my voice remarkably steady. "But we need to understand each other right now. I spent my entire marriage making myself small so Harrison could feel big. I will not disappear into another caregiving role. I will not manage your schedule, and I will not speak for you." Beatrice offered a small, genuine smile. "I do not want a nurse, Meredith. I want an ally. Every medical decision regarding my health will be handled exclusively by Naomi and my independent doctors. You have spent 5 years fighting just to breathe. You deserve to live your own life." Before I could thank her, a sharp ringing shattered the quiet kitchen. Naomi pulled her cell phone from her blazer pocket. She checked the screen, and her professional mask instantly turned rigid. "It is Harrison's legal counsel. Put it on speaker," Beatrice commanded. Naomi tapped the screen and placed the device in the center of the island. Naomi Brooks speaking. "Naomi, this is David Mercer." A deep voice crackled through the small speaker. "I have my client on the line with me." "Meredith." Harrison's voice filled the room. I stopped breathing. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. It had been 5 years since I heard him speak my name, yet his tone remained perfectly modulated. He sounded gentle, reasonable, and thick with that manufactured disappointment I used to dread. "I know you are there, Meredith," the voice on the phone continued. "And I know you are still angry about the divorce. But exploiting a severely ill elderly woman to secure a dead man's fortune is a new low, even for you." "Harrison," Naomi interrupted smoothly, refusing to let him control the narrative. "Your mother is a legal resident of this property, and she has been declared fully competent by 2 independent medical professionals." "My mother has episodes," Harrison countered. He ignored the lawyer completely, directing his words entirely at me. His voice dropped to a soft, intimate register. "She gets confused, sweetheart. You do not know how to handle her condition. I know you think you are helping, but you are putting her in extreme danger." I looked at Beatrice. The color had completely drained from her face. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, trembling violently, but she gave me a sharp nod. She was not going to break. "I am formally requesting an immediate welfare check," Harrison announced, shifting from intimate concern to cold authority. "I expect full access to the East Wing within the hour. If you refuse, I will involve the authorities." "You may send whoever you like," Naomi replied, her tone perfectly even, "but you will not cross the property line without a warrant." The attorney ended the call. The silence left behind felt incredibly heavy, thick with impending conflict. "He is not going to wait for a warrant," Beatrice whispered, staring blindly at the dark phone screen. She was absolutely right. Less than 20 minutes later, the internal chime of the estate security system echoed loudly through the long hallway. Naomi walked quickly over to the wall-mounted control panel and tapped the screen to bring up the front gate cameras. I followed her, my worn shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble. I stood behind the attorney's shoulder and stared at the high-definition color feed. The morning sky was gray and overcast. Standing just outside the heavy wrought iron gates was Harrison Pike. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, his hair perfectly styled despite the damp wind. He was holding a large bouquet of white lilies, looking every inch the devoted, heartbroken son desperate to save his mother. Standing right next to him, resting a hand casually on his utility belt, was a uniformed city police officer. Harrison stepped forward and pressed the silver intercom button on the stone pillar. His voice piped through the wall speaker in the hallway, clear and chillingly calm. "I am here to rescue my mother." The heavy iron gate remained securely locked. Harrison stood on the wet asphalt, the collar of his expensive charcoal overcoat turned up against the morning drizzle. He held a bouquet of white lilies down at his side. Beside him stood a uniformed city police officer. "I am here to rescue my mother," Harrison repeated through the intercom, his voice distorted by the small speaker but completely void of panic. Naomi Brooks stepped forward and pressed the silver communication button. "Officer, this is Naomi Brooks. I serve as legal counsel for this estate." You may enter through the pedestrian gate to conduct your welfare check, but Mr. Pike must remain on the public sidewalk. The officer leaned into his radio microphone. Ma'am, the Sun filed a missing person report. This is private property, Naomi countered, her tone carrying the absolute weight of the law. Beatrice Pike resides here, and she declines to see her son. You may verify her safety, or you may return with a signed warrant. A tense, heavy black boot stepped onto the gravel driveway as the officer walked briskly toward the mansion. We moved into the formal guest parlor. Beatrice sat down in a high-backed velvet chair, smoothing the fabric of her gray trousers. When the officer stepped into the room, his wet jacket smelled strongly of damp wool and street rain. He took off his hat, looking around the opulent space before letting his gaze settle on Beatrice. Mrs. Pike, the officer began, sounding entirely cautious. My name is Officer Miller. Your son is deeply concerned about your well-being. He stated you were removed from a secure memory care unit without his knowledge. Beatrice offered him a polite, calm smile. Good morning, Officer Miller. I imagine my son told you quite a vivid story. Please, take a seat. The policeman perched on the edge of the leather sofa and pulled out a small notepad. Can you tell me your full name and today's date? My name is Beatrice Eleanor Pike, she answered, never breaking eye contact. Today is Thursday, October the 12th. I currently live in the east wing of the estate, inherited by my daughter-in-law, Meredith Lane. Officer Miller blinked, clearly surprised by the sharp precision of her voice. Your son claims to hold medical power of attorney, ma'am. He says your condition requires a locked ward. Naomi stepped forward and placed a thick file directly onto the coffee table. Harrison Pike never held court-appointed guardianship. He operated under a highly questionable financial proxy. That document contains 2 independent assessments from board-certified neurologists completed 18 months ago. They confirm Mrs. Pike is fully competent to make her own legal and medical decisions. She signed her own discharge papers from Silver Haven and walked out voluntarily. The officer picked up the file. He flipped through the dense pages, pausing at the gold medical board seals. The rain battered against the tall windows, filling the quiet room as he read the concluding paragraphs. A visible shift occurred in his posture. The protective suspicion melted away, replaced by the weary exhaustion of a man who had walked into a massive family dispute. Everything appears completely in order, Officer Miller said, closing the folder and standing up. I apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Pike. You are clearly in no danger here. Thank you for doing your job, officer, Beatrice replied graciously. We watched through the security monitor as the policeman marched down the driveway and passed through the iron gate. He spoke to Harrison for less than a minute, shaking his head and pointing back toward his patrol car. Harrison maintained his perfect posture, nodding understandingly. But the moment the officer drove away, the facility director turned his attention entirely toward the camera. The mask of the grieving son vanished. His dark eyes locked onto the lens, cold and unblinking. You think you are so incredibly clever, Harrison said, his voice drifting through the open intercom line. The volume was low, meant only for us. You always needed someone richer to save you, Meredith. First it was me, and now it is a dead old man. A sharp spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream, but I forced my hands to remain perfectly still at my sides. He wanted me to grab the microphone. He wanted a screaming match to prove I was exactly the chaotic burden he had always claimed I was. I stayed absolutely quiet. I am not going to sue you for the house, Harrison continued, changing his tactics when I refused to take the bait. I do not care about Gideon's money, just let me speak to my mother privately for 10 minutes. That is all I am asking. You owe me that much after everything I provided for you during our marriage. Beatrice reached past me and pressed the communication button herself. Go home, Harrison, she commanded, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Mom, please, he pleaded, shifting instantly back into a wounded register. She is manipulating you. You do not remember things clearly. You need my help. I do not need the kind of help that comes in a locked room, Beatrice stated flatly, and pulled her finger away from the button. Harrison stood in the rain for another 30 seconds. He knew the door was not going to open. He leaned extremely close to the camera, his breath fogging the small glass lens. Rebecca and Owen will hear about this, the man whispered, delivering the threat with brutal precision. They know how sick you are, Mom. And they know Meredith is an opportunistic failure. When your other children pull up to these gates, they are not going to leave without you. He turned around, walked to his sleek vehicle, and drove away into the gray morning. The hallway fell dead silent. Beatrice stared at the empty video feed, and a sudden tremor shook her entire body. The commanding presence she had maintained for the police officer evaporated, leaving behind a terrified mother who had just been threatened with her own family. "They will not listen to me," Beatrice gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "Harrison has been telling them I am violent and confused for 3.5 years. Rebecca trusts him completely. She will think you have taken me hostage." Before I could offer a word of comfort, a sharp ringing shattered the quiet air. My cell phone vibrated violently inside my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen since the week my divorce was finalized. It was Rebecca Pike. Harrison's younger sister was a highly successful pediatric dentist, a woman known for her fierce loyalty and her absolute lack of patience for emotional drama. I looked at Naomi, who gave me a curt, encouraging nod. I swiped the green icon and put the device on speakerphone, placing it carefully on a small wooden side table. "Meredith." Rebecca started immediately, her voice fast and sharp as a scalpel. "I do not know what kind of twisted revenge fantasy you are playing out right now, but you have exactly one chance to explain why my mother is inside your house." "Hello, Rebecca," I replied, keeping my tone intentionally low and steady. "I am glad you called. Your mother is sitting right here, and she is perfectly safe." "She is incredibly sick," Rebecca snapped back. "Do not pretend you suddenly care about her. You have not visited her once in 5 years, and do not put her on the phone. Harrison already warned us you would try to coach her through a conversation to make yourself look like a savior." A second voice joined the line, slightly muffled but full of hesitation. It was Owen, the youngest sibling, a high school science teacher who usually avoided conflict at all costs. "Meredith, this is Owen. Look, we just want to bring Mom back to her care unit. We know she has aggressive episodes. Harrison told us everything." "He told you lies," I said plainly, refusing to use their brother's manufactured medical vocabulary. Rebecca let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "My mother sent me a message 2 weeks ago saying she never wanted to see my face again. She explicitly told me to stop asking the nurses about her because I was a disappointment. Do not sit there and tell me she is fine. She has completely lost her grip on reality, and Harrison is the only one who has been carrying the burden of managing her care." Across the hallway, Beatrice let out a small, broken sound. Her pale eyes widened in absolute horror. She stumbled backward, hitting the wall and sliding down until she was sitting on a small wooden bench. She had never written those words. Knowing her daughter had spent the last 2 weeks carrying that kind of fabricated heartbreak shattered her remaining composure. I watched Beatrice quietly weep, and the cold stone in my chest turned into a burning fire. "Listen to me very carefully," I told the phone, my voice hardening into steel. "I am not going to argue with you over a speakerphone. You want to see your mother? Come to the estate tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Both of you. Bring whatever medical records Harrison gave you. But if you bring him with you, the gates will not open." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Owen murmuring something in the background. "Fine," Rebecca finally agreed, her tone laced with raw hostility. "We will be there at 9. And if we even suspect you are manipulating her to get your hands on the rest of Gideon's money, I will personally drag you into civil court." She terminated the call with a loud click. I picked up the phone and walked over to Beatrice. I knelt down on the polished floor in front of her, taking her trembling hands in mine. She was completely devastated, overwhelmed by the fact that her own children believed she hated them. "I never said those things," the older woman whispered, tears spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. "I never stopped wanting them. I asked the nursing staff for a telephone every single day." Naomi stepped forward, her leather shoes clicking softly against the marble. Her eyes were sharp, calculating the legal angles of the emotional tragedy unfolding in front of us. "Meredith," Naomi instructed, pulling a sleek silver laptop from her briefcase, "I need you to text Rebecca right now. Tell her to send you screenshots of every single horrible message she claims Beatrice sent her over the past 3 years." "Why?" I asked, pulling my phone back out. Because people who construct elaborate cages usually leave fingerprints on the locks, the attorney replied grimly. I sent the text. 10 minutes later, my phone pinged with an incoming email from Rebecca's dental clinic account. The attachment contained 12 different images. Naomi connected her laptop to the wireless printer, sitting in Gideon's old study. The machine whirred to life, spitting out warm, crisp pages filled with text message bubbles. We spread the printed papers across the massive dining room table. I leaned over the documents, reading the terrible, cruel rejections sent to Rebecca and Owen. The words were brutal. They called Owen ungrateful. They called Rebecca overbearing. But as I read the third page, a distinct pattern began to emerge. The phrasing felt completely unnatural for a retired history teacher. Look at this sentence, I said, tapping my index finger against a specific text bubble sent to Owen. It says, "Your constant inquiries are not clinically advisable for my routine." Beatrice would never use the phrase, clinically advisable. She would say disruptive. Beatrice leaned closer, wiping her eyes with a linen handkerchief. She pointed to a message sent to Rebecca. This one uses the nickname, Becca. I have never called my daughter Becca in her entire 42 years of life. I always use her full name. The sick, twisting feeling of familiarity washed over me again. During my divorce, my own attorney had received 3 strange, unhinged emails from my personal account, claiming I was hiding assets and planning to flee the state. I had not written them. Harrison had figured out my password, logged into my account from his tablet, and sent those emails to make me look completely unreliable to my own legal counsel. I had spent thousands of dollars proving the emails were spoofed, draining the last of my settlement money in the process. Harrison is repeating the exact same pattern, I said aloud, the pieces snapping together with terrifying clarity. He used my email to isolate me from my lawyer. He used your phone account to isolate you from your children. Naomi pulled a pair of reading glasses from her pocket and slid them onto her face. She focused on the small timestamps printed above the text bubbles. Beatrice, the attorney asked, her voice dropping into a serious, investigative register. Do you remember your medication schedule at Silver Haven? The facility dispensed my heavy dose of anxiolytics every afternoon right after the lunch trays were cleared. Beatrice answered instantly, her memory for the daily routine perfectly intact. By 2 o'clock, I was almost entirely unconscious. I slept until dinner every single day. Naomi pulled a silver pen from her jacket and circled 4 different timestamps on the printed pages. These 4 messages, the cruelest ones in the batch, were all sent between 2:15 and 2:45 in the afternoon. You were physically incapable of typing a coherent sentence at that hour. We need digital proof, I insisted, looking at the attorney. Harrison will just claim she fought off the medication, or that she typed them during a moment of sudden clarity. He always has an answer for everything. Naomi did not argue. She opened her laptop, scanned the high-resolution images, and drafted a secure email. I am sending these screenshots to a digital forensics expert I keep on retainer for corporate fraud cases. He can run a preliminary trace on the routing metadata embedded in the carrier network. We sat at the long dining table for the next 3 hours. The afternoon sun vanished behind the thick rain clouds, plunging the estate into a deep, stormy gray. June, the quiet housekeeper, brought in a tray of hot tea and sandwiches, but none of us touched the food. We were waiting for the invisible numbers to tell us the truth. Shortly after 6 o'clock in the evening, Naomi's laptop chimed with an incoming notification. The attorney opened the message. She read the screen in complete silence, her jaw tightening with every line she processed. She slowly turned the laptop around so Beatrice and I could see the digital report. The spreadsheet was filled with complex alphanumeric codes, but the summary at the bottom was written in plain, undeniable English. My forensics contact pulled the synchronization data from the cellular provider, Naomi explained, pointing to a highlighted row. The messages were technically sent using Beatrice's cloud account credentials, but they did not originate from her physical mobile device. Where did they come from? I asked, though my gut already knew the horrible answer. The routing protocol traced the transmission IP address directly to the commercial internet network registered to Silver Haven Senior Living, the attorney stated. Specifically, the data packet bounced off a private desktop computer located in the executive administrative suite. And it happened exactly when Beatrice was documented as heavily sedated. The room grew incredibly cold. The reality of the situation hung heavily in the air between us. Harrison had not just supervised his mother's care. He had sat at his massive mahogany desk, sipping expensive coffee, and methodically typed out messages designed to break his siblings' hearts. He made Rebecca and Owen believe their mother despised them, effectively weaponizing their own grief to keep them away from the locked doors of the memory care unit. Beatrice placed her hands flat on the table. She looked at the metadata report, and the last lingering traces of her fear were instantly replaced by a towering, magnificent rage. "He stole my voice," the older woman whispered, her tone vibrating with a newfound strength. "He used my name to hurt my children." Before we could discuss our next move, the bright screen of my cell phone lit up again. It was another text message from Rebecca. I picked up the device and read the short, aggressive sentence glowing against the dark background. "We are coming tomorrow morning," the message read. "If this is a trick, I will take Mom out myself." The printed visitor log from Silver Haven Senior Living lay perfectly flat on the mahogany table. It felt stiff under my fingertips, smelling faintly of old toner and sterile office air. We had left the documents out all night. A single line of black ink halfway down the second page documented a refusal of entry. Harrison had signed his own name on the administrative override line, authorizing the security desk to turn away his own sister. I was 39 years old, and my entire life had been shaped by a man who treated truth as a highly flexible commodity. Now, I was standing inside a $10 million mansion, waiting for the people he had manipulated to walk through the front doors. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9:15 in the morning. June had brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, and the rich, bitter scent filled the grand foyer. I stood near the front window, watching the heavy wrought iron gates. My stomach churned with a familiar, sour anxiety. 5 years ago, the combined disapproval of the Pike family had completely crushed me. Now, I was the one holding the keys to the castle. A silver luxury sedan turned off the main road and idled in front of the security camera. Naomi Brooks stepped up beside me, holding her leather briefcase. The attorney pressed the release button on the intercom console, and the massive gates swung open without a single sound. The sedan crawled up the long, circular driveway, its tires crunching softly against the wet gravel. "Let them set the tone," Naomi instructed quietly. Her voice carried the calm precision of a woman who spent her life inside courtrooms. "Harrison filled their heads with terrifying scenarios, so they are walking into this house expecting an ambush. Do not give them one." I nodded, wiping my damp palms against the fabric of my dark trousers. The heavy oak front door swung open. Rebecca Pike marched into the foyer like a general inspecting a poorly managed battlefield. She wore a sharp gray trench coat, clutching a thick leather notebook tightly against her chest. Owen followed closely behind her. The high school science teacher looked utterly exhausted, holding a faded plastic grocery bag that presumably contained old family photographs. He kept his eyes fixed on the marble floor, avoiding my gaze entirely. "Where is she?" Rebecca demanded, completely ignoring common courtesy. Her voice echoed harshly off the high ceiling. "I am not playing games today, Meredith. Take us to our mother." I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a polite greeting. I simply gestured down the wide corridor leading toward the east wing. "She is waiting for you in the private parlor," I replied. "The room is at the end of the hall. I will not be present while you speak with her." That simple boundary caught the pediatric dentist completely off guard. Her defensive posture faltered for a fraction of a second. She had clearly prepared for a massive confrontation, fully expecting me to act as a manipulative gatekeeper. Owen let out a slow, shaking breath, and the two siblings walked past me without another word. I waited until they turned the corner before following at a quiet distance. The architecture of the mansion allowed sound to travel perfectly down the corridor. I stopped outside the open parlor doors, leaning my shoulder against the cool plaster wall, and listened to the reunion Harrison had spent 3 years trying to prevent. Inside the room, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Beatrice sat in her high-backed velvet chair, wearing a dark blue blouse and her signature pearl earrings. She looked dignified and entirely present, but Rebecca did not offer a hug, and she did not shed a tear. Instead, the daughter flipped open her leather notebook, treating the moment like a hostile medical deposition. "Mom, what was the address of the house where we grew up?" Rebecca asked, her tone flat and clinical. Beatrice did not hesitate. 422 Elm Street, she answered softly. What was the name of the golden retriever we had when Owen was born? Rebecca asked next. Barnaby, the older woman replied. He chewed the legs off the kitchen chairs. Rebecca scribbled something on her legal pad. The scratching sound of the pen felt unnecessarily cruel. And what month did Harrison move you into the memory care unit? Rebecca questioned. Silence crashed into the room. It was not a hesitant pause. It was a suffocating, heavy void. I closed my eyes, pressing the back of my head against the hallway wall. During her time at Silver Haven, the facility doctors had heavily escalated Beatrice's sedatives. The chemical fog wiped out exact dates, blurring entire seasons together. Harrison knew this, and he had undoubtedly warned his sister that any hesitation was absolute proof of severe dementia. It was raining, Beatrice finally murmured. The tremor in her voice broke my heart. Late winter. Or perhaps early spring. They had changed my dosage that week. Rebecca let out a sharp, devastated sigh. Mom, you do not even know when you lived there. You are confused. Harrison told us this would happen. He said Meredith was just coaching you to remember the easy things. I could not stand in the hallway another second. I stepped through the open doors, my worn shoes clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. Chemical restraints create permanent memory gaps, I announced, walking directly toward the coffee table. I did not yell, but my voice carried the absolute authority of a physical therapist who handled complex rehabilitation cases every single night. Not remembering a specific date under heavy sedation does not mean she lacks legal capacity right now, Rebecca. Trauma and medication do not erase a person's fundamental autonomy. My sister-in-law spun around, her eyes flashing with renewed anger. She pointed a manicured finger at me. You have no right to interfere in this family. You are just using an old woman to protect your inheritance. Meredith is absolutely correct, Beatrice interrupted, her voice suddenly hardening into steel. The retired history teacher sat up straighter, gripping the carved wooden armrests of her chair. She refused to shrink under her daughter's judgment any longer. And I have a question for you, Rebecca. The dentist lowered her hand, completely thrown off balance by the sudden shift in power. How many times did you try to call me without going through your brother? Beatrice asked. Her pale blue eyes locked onto her daughter, demanding an honest answer. Rebecca swallowed hard. The defensive anger in her face began to crack. Harrison told us you did not want to speak to anyone. He said phone calls triggered your aggressive episodes. The older woman turned her attention to her youngest son. Owen still stood near the doorway, clutching his plastic bag of photographs like a shield. And you, Owen? Why did you never drive up to the facility to see me in person? Owen looked down at his shoes, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. Harrison told us the doctors explicitly forbade unapproved visitors. He said it caused you too much distress, and the medical staff requested that we stay away for the sake of your heart condition. I see, Beatrice whispered. The profound sadness in those two words seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. She turned her head and looked across the parlor at Naomi Brooks. The estate attorney stepped forward from the corner of the room. She unclasped her briefcase and placed a thick stack of photocopied documents directly onto the glass coffee table. These are standard call request forms, Beatrice explained, pointing a shaking finger at the papers. 27 of them. I filled them out myself, begging the nursing staff to let me use the administrative telephone to call my children. Rebecca stepped forward. She picked up the top sheet of paper. Her hands began to tremble so violently the document rattled in the quiet room. She recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. Naomi slid a different document across the glass. This is the official visitor log from the Silver Haven front desk. Look at the date highlighted in yellow. The dentist stared at the printed ledger, all the color completely drained from her face. She dropped her leather notebook onto the floor. I was in the lobby that afternoon, she whispered, her voice choking on a sudden sob. I brought yellow roses. Harrison came downstairs and told me you threw a water glass at the wall when you heard my name. I was not even in the building, Beatrice replied, the truth landing like a physical blow. I was at an outside dental clinic getting a crown replaced. Owen abruptly dropped his plastic bag. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and scrolled frantically for several seconds. He held the glowing screen out toward Naomi and his sister. Harrison showed us text messages. He proved Mom was rejecting us. Look at this one. Naomi adjusted her glasses and read the screen aloud. It says to tell my youngest boy I am too tired to deal with him today. Mom has never called me her youngest boy in my entire life, Owen explained, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. She always called me her baby. He looked at his mother, and the horrible, crushing realization finally settled over him. The older brother they had trusted implicitly had spent 3 years building a silent, invisible wall between them. Harrison had used forged clinical notes, manipulated schedules, and spoofed text messages to keep them entirely separated. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. We stood in the parlor, surrounded by the shattered pieces of the Pike family mythology. June rolled a wooden serving cart into the adjoining dining room an hour later. But nobody touched the catered lunch. The atmosphere remained thick with a suffocating kind of guilt. Owen sat at the long mahogany table, wiping his eyes with a paper napkin and staring blankly at the wall. Rebecca picked up a silver fork, turned it over twice, and set it back down without taking a single bite. "You do not need to punish yourselves," Beatrice finally said. She sat at the head of the table, her hands resting quietly in her lap. "I do not need apologies right now, and I certainly do not want your pity. I just need you to stop letting Harrison speak for me." I watched from the corner of the room. The transition happening in front of me was profound. Harrison had always isolated people by making them fear the judgment of the group. He had kept Meredith away from Gideon out of shame, and he had kept Rebecca and Owen away from Beatrice out of guilt. Now that the isolation was broken, his entire system of control was collapsing. Rebecca is a medical professional. When she faces an emotional crisis, she survives it by retreating into hard, unforgiving data. She sat up straighter, pushing her untouched plate away and clearing her throat. "If he lied about your medical condition," Rebecca stated, her tone turning cold and sharp, "then he lied about the estate." "Naomi, I want to see the financial records." The attorney nodded. She had clearly anticipated this exact request. Naomi opened a secure blue folder and extracted a thick stack of bank statements. She spread the printed pages across the polished wood, creating a timeline of transactions that stretched back 3 years. "We are still conducting a full forensic audit," the attorney explained, tapping her silver pen against the top page. "But we have already identified a massive, undeniable irregularity. Over the past 3 years, exactly $420,000 was transferred from Beatrice's personal funds into a corporate shell account affiliated with Silver Haven Senior Living." Owen frowned, leaning forward to look at the staggering numbers. Was that money used to pay for her residential care at the facility? "The internal memos claim they were enhanced care management fees," I pointed out, walking over to the table and tracing the chronological dates with my index finger. "But look closely at the last 12 transactions. Those automated charges occurred over the past 18 months. Your mother has been living in this house, completely free of charge, for a year and a half." Harrison continued draining her checking accounts long after she legally left his building. The room went completely still. The reality of the situation hung heavily in the air. This was no longer a messy family dispute about difficult medical care or emotional misunderstandings. It was calculated, systematic theft. It was elder financial abuse on a massive scale. Rebecca traced the routing numbers on the statement, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "This does not make any logical sense," the dentist muttered, shaking her head. "Harrison had administrative access to view the balances, yes. But Mom's primary trust account requires dual authorization for any external wire transfer over $5,000. The bank would absolutely require her direct signature to authorize these recurring withdrawals." Naomi did not say a word. She simply reached into the blue folder one last time. The attorney placed a single sheet of paper in the exact center of the table. It was a high-quality photocopy of a highly detailed legal document. The heading at the top identified it as a durable power of attorney. The dense legal paragraphs granted Harrison Pike absolute financial control over all of his mother's assets, properties, and medical directives. Beatrice leaned over the mahogany table. She stared at the black ink at the bottom of the page for a very long time. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked out 4 slow, agonizing seconds. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the large windows, illuminating the jagged, looping letters of her own name resting on the signature line. My mother-in-law slowly lifted her head, She looked directly at her daughter, her pale eyes wide with absolute horror. "I never signed that," Beatrice whispered. The diner sat on the edge of the industrial district, surrounded by rusted scrap metal yards and abandoned warehouses. Rain slicked the pavement outside, reflecting the dull orange glow of flickering sodium streetlights. Inside, the air smelled of stale fryer grease and industrial-strength floor cleaner. Elena Ruiz sat in the back booth, her coat still zipped tight against the draft coming from the cracked window. She did not greet me when I slid into the vinyl seat. Her dark eyes darted toward the entrance, monitoring every car that crunched across the gravel lot. I watched her hands. They were raw, red, and calloused from years of lifting patients who had no one else to hold them. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "You should not have called me," Elena whispered, refusing to look at my face. "Harrison Pike is an incredibly vengeful man. He destroyed my career because I dared to point out that a resident was being overmedicated. What makes you think you are strong enough to withstand that kind of pressure?" I did not offer her a polite lie. I did not pretend this was safe. I simply set my hands on the table, palms up. "I have $85 million in potential trust assets and a lawyer who makes a sport out of exposing corporate fraud. He cannot touch me with his usual tactics, but I cannot bring him down without the truth." Elena stared at me for a long time, searching for a sign that I was not just another entitled woman looking for an easy settlement. She reached into a large, weather-beaten leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. The paper felt heavy, carrying the distinct, sharp odor of sterilized hospital rooms. "These are the original medication logs from the East Wing," she said, pushing the file toward me. "I kept these copies the day before they transferred me to the graveyard shift." I opened the folder. My physical therapy background kicked in instantly, my eyes scanning the medical shorthand for dosage frequencies and patient responses. I knew exactly what a patient looked like when they were recovering from a standard stroke. I also knew what they looked like when they were being systematically drugged into a vegetative state. "These dosages are impossibly high," I muttered, tracing the columns with my index finger. Beatrice was receiving triple, the maximum recommended allowance for severe anxiety. "Look at the signature line on the physician orders," Elena prompted, pointing to a series of looping, hurried initials. "Every single adjustment to the sedative schedule was authorized by Dr. Malcolm Voss. But Harrison was the facility administrator," I countered, turning the page. "He is not a doctor. He cannot legally write these prescriptions." The nurse opened a secondary envelope, dumping out a stack of printed emails and handwritten sticky notes. "Harrison did not hold the pen," she explained, her voice hardening with residual fury. "He held the contracts. He spent 3 years sending these emails to Dr. Voss, explicitly demanding that Beatrice remain manageable during evaluation hours. He scheduled the cognitive testing for the exact windows when he knew the sedative levels would be at their absolute peak in her system. He threatened to terminate the doctor's entire consulting contract if those dosages were lowered." I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. The systematic cruelty was breathtaking. Harrison had used his power as a corporate executive to force a medical professional into committing chemical abuse, all to build a legal mountain of evidence that his mother was losing her mind. I turned the page, searching for the incident reports that should have been filed every time she fell or became incoherent. "Where are the incident reports for the afternoon she was non-responsive?" I asked, flipping through the binder. Elena reached into her bag one last time, pulling out a single, wrinkled sheet of blue carbon paper. "This was my original report from 3 years ago," she whispered. "I documented that Beatrice complained about her son entering her room and taking her personal belongings, including her wallet and her medical alert bracelet. I filed this with the front desk." I read the handwritten note. The detail was incredibly precise. "When I checked the digital system the following week, the record had been changed," Elena added. "Harrison used his administrative override password to delete my notes. He altered the official record to classify her claims of theft as resident paranoia and visual hallucinations." The level of administrative control he exerted was staggering. He had the power to literally rewrite reality inside that building. I tucked the folder securely into my own bag, feeling the physical weight of the evidence pressing against my side. "I will make sure this reaches the court," I promised. Elena stood up, pulling her coat tight. "Do not just take it to the court," she warned. "Harrison has friends in the state health department." You need a preservation order from a judge who cannot be bought. A soft digital chime sounded from the center of the diner booth. I pulled my phone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. A new notification had appeared. A secure message from a private courier service. I clicked the link, and a high-resolution video file began to play. The footage came from the overhead security camera in the memory care hallway. It was 3 years old, grainy and silent, but the identity of the person walking down the corridor was unmistakable. Harrison Pike strolled into the frame, pausing to check his watch before unlocking his mother's private room. 3 minutes later, he stepped out, his hands now occupied by a small wooden jewelry box and the familiar silver medical alert bracelet. The next day, he sat in a conference room with Dr. Voss, calmly discussing his mother's rapid, unexplained cognitive decline. I watched the video twice, my chest tightening with a profound sense of clarity. The physical proof of his deception was right there on the screen. He had created the very symptoms he later presented to the medical board. I stepped out of the diner into the pouring rain, the cold water stinging my face. My cell phone vibrated again. It was not Naomi. It was a formal complaint sent directly to the director of my rehabilitation clinic, written on the official letterhead of Silver Haven Senior Living. The document claimed I was using my position as a therapist to exploit a vulnerable dementia patient for financial gain. The letter was a transparent attempt at retaliation, designed to panic me into dropping the case to save my job. I did not panic. I simply saved the document to my private cloud storage. Harrison was terrified, and he was running out of tactical options. The final text came through just as I reached my car. An unknown number had sent a screenshot of a conversation between Harrison and Celeste. "Make sure she looks confused when Voss comes," the message read. "Hide the blue folder again." I leaned my forehead against the cool steering wheel, watching the rain blur the lights of the parking lot. The blue folder was the missing piece of the puzzle. I had the medication logs, I had the video evidence, and I had the proof of his administrative interference. Now I just needed to find out what exactly he had hidden inside that folder, and why he was so incredibly terrified that Beatrice might remember signing it. The mansion felt like a tomb when I returned late that night. I walked directly into the study, the dark oak shelves towering over me like silent witnesses to the family tragedy. Naomi was already there, pacing the floor with a glass of water in her hand. "They tried to kill my medical license," I said, setting the folder down on the desk. The attorney stopped pacing. "Harrison filed a formal complaint?" I nodded, placing the printed document on top of the medication logs. "He knows we have the evidence. He is trying to force me to resign so he can argue that I am an unethical actor during the guardianship hearing." Naomi stepped closer, reading the baseless accusations with a cool, detached interest. "We will use this in the counter-filing," she stated, picking up her silver pen. "This is clear evidence of witness intimidation and retaliatory harassment. It will destroy his credibility with the judge. But we still need the blue folder." Celeste was right. Whatever he forced her to sign in that emergency room holds the secret to his financial motives. I opened my laptop, pulling up the digital map Elena had sketched for me on the diner napkin. It depicted the basement archive level of Silver Haven, a complex, subterranean maze that had not been updated in over 20 years. "There is a service tunnel behind the laundry facilities," I said, pointing to the sketch. If the digital records were altered by Harrison's override, the physical paper binder must still be sitting on the original shelves. Naomi shook her head, pulling a thick law book from her briefcase. "If you go into that basement, you are breaking into a private facility. He will have you arrested, and the judge will grant him emergency custody of his mother before we even get to the courthouse." I looked at the blue folder evidence, then toward the east wing where Beatrice was sleeping. "We do not have to break in," I said, my pulse beginning to hammer against my ribs. "We have the internal audit records now. We can force the State Regulatory Commission to perform an unannounced, mandatory inspection of the basement archives." Naomi smiled, a slow, predatory expression. "I like the way you think, Meredith. I will file the request for a regulatory site visit before the sun comes up tomorrow morning." I retreated to my bedroom, but sleep remained entirely impossible. I laid awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if we had missed a single detail. Harrison was a man who planned for every contingency, a man who built a career on the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to see the cracks in his carefully managed reality. He had not counted on a daughter-in-law who spent years eating scraps, a nurse who remembered the truth, and a mother who was finally dangerously awake. The morning arrived with a thin, pale light that crept across the floorboards. I was already sitting at the kitchen island when the house began to wake up. Beatrice walked into the room, her movements stiff but steady. "You look like you have been awake all night," she noted, pouring a cup of hot tea. "I have been thinking about the blue folder," I replied, sliding the map across the counter. "We are getting the state investigators to seize the basement archives today. If the original signature is in there, we can prove the forgery." Beatrice stopped, her tea halfway to her lips. She stared at the map, and her expression shifted from calm resolve to something much more complicated. "I do not think the folder is in the basement," she whispered, her voice dropping to a low, troubled tone. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Harrison was always paranoid about the physical documents," she explained, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "He kept a personal safe in his private office, the one with the heavy keypad lock. He told me that was where he kept the family legacy. I think he took the folder home with him the day after I left the facility. He never wanted the facility staff to know the details of the financial transactions he was conducting." I felt the blood drain from my face. That changes everything. If the folder is in his house, we cannot reach it without a warrant. And he will shred it the moment he suspects the police are closing in. Naomi walked into the room, overhearing the final part of our conversation. She did not look distressed. She looked like she had just solved a complex crossword puzzle. "He would not keep the folder in his office if he was truly worried about a raid," the attorney said, pulling out her chair. "He would keep it inside his marital home, thinking it was protected by the sanctity of his private residence. But there is a massive gap in his logic. He is currently focused entirely on protecting his corporate reputation. He thinks the investigation is centered on the facility medical records. He does not know we have already secured the proof of his administrative overrides." She opened her laptop and typed a few keys. "We don't need a warrant to get him to bring the evidence to us," Naomi added with a dark, confident smirk. "We just need to give him a reason to think he can still win." I stared at the attorney, a sudden, cold clarity washing over me. "You want to bait him?" "I want to offer him a deal," Naomi corrected, her eyes fixed on the screen. "He is frantic, terrified, and convinced he can still manage this disaster if he only had the original documents to prove his mother was confused. If we signal that we are prepared to settle, he will do anything to regain control of the narrative." The house felt like a powder keg, the silence heavy and expectant. I stood in the center of the kitchen, watching the digital clock on the oven display change from 5 to 6. Each passing minute felt like a direct assault on my remaining composure. I had spent 5 years hiding in the shadows of his life, terrified of his reach and his influence. Now I was standing in the middle of his carefully constructed trap, holding the shears that would eventually cut the wires. "If this plan fails," I said, looking at Beatrice, "he will use every single dollar he has left to make sure we are destroyed." The older woman reached out, her pale hand steady and warm against my skin. "He has already destroyed everything he could possibly touch, Meredith," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet, terrifying certainty. "The only thing he has left to lose is his own story. And that is exactly what we are going to take from him today." I walked out to the grand foyer, the tall windows reflecting the cold, overcast sky outside. My phone vibrated against my leg. It was a new text message from Celeste. "He is coming back to the estate," the young woman wrote. "He is panicked. He thinks he can force you to drop the complaints if he shows you the primary power of attorney. He has the blue folder in his car right now." I felt the adrenaline surge through my limbs, a familiar, sharpened focus that made the world slow down. Naomi was right. He was coming to us, bringing the very evidence we needed to lock him away for the rest of his natural life. I walked back to the kitchen, where Naomi was already drafting the terms of a fake negotiation. The attorney looked up, her expression calm and methodical. "Tell him you are willing to speak," Naomi directed, her voice carrying the absolute weight of a tactical command. "Tell him you want to see the original documents before you discuss any settlement terms." I looked at the kitchen clock again. It was almost 7 o'clock. I picked up the burner phone. My fingers didn't tremble. I typed out the words that would finalize the destruction of my former husband. "I am listening," I wrote, and pressed the send button. The silence that followed the transmission was deafening. I looked at the front gate monitor. A few minutes later, the dark SUV turned off the main road, its headlights cutting a path through the gathering dusk. He was coming. He was walking directly into the trap he had spent 3 years building for his own mother. I leaned against the marble counter, letting the feeling of safety finally settle into my bones. For the first time in 5 years, the locked door did not mean I had been abandoned. It meant I was finally the one in control. When you hear the story of Meredith and Beatrice, you might recognize a very quiet, incredibly dangerous kind of theft happening in your own world. It does not always begin with a sudden act of physical violence or a loud argument in the middle of the night. Sometimes, someone steals your life one tiny piece at a time. They might start by moving your keys, isolating you from your children, controlling your bank accounts, and calmly telling everyone around you that you are simply too tired or too confused to understand what is happening. You might find yourself spending years surviving on whatever emotional or financial scraps someone else decides to leave behind for you. You slowly convince yourself that if you are just useful enough, if you remain quiet enough, or if you care for them perfectly, they will finally grant you the safety and respect you so deeply deserve. But the hardest lesson is that true care is never the same thing as ownership. Genuine love does not require you to surrender your voice, your financial independence, or your grip on reality just to keep a fragile peace inside your family. There is a massive, life-altering difference between a locked door used as a weapon and a locked gate used as a protective boundary. You do not need a fortune to enforce your boundaries. You only need the courage to stop protecting the people who consistently hurt you. You hold the right to demand total accountability, to keep your own records, and to build a life where you do not have to wait for others to finish before you grant yourself permission to live freely. Have you ever found yourself shrinking your own needs and hiding your voice just to keep someone else comfortable, only to realize they were intentionally using your silence to control your life? How did you finally find the strength to set your firm boundary and lock your own gate against that abuse? Share your personal story in the comments below, because your survival might be the exact proof another woman needs to finally walk away and reclaim her own table.